Are you suffering? We all suffer in some ways. I'm Dr. Carol. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to talk about suffering today. And so, this is an episode for everyone because we all suffer. Whether that is physical pain, illness, disability in your body, mental, emotional struggles, maybe trauma from the past that you are struggling to find healing from, broken relationships, marriage, parent, child, friends, the relationships around you, even suffering between you and God. Now, certainly that's our perspective, but we're going to talk about that today. To help me do that is someone I respect and value greatly, Dr. Curt Thompson. His recent book, The Deepest Place, Suffering and the Formation of Hope. He contends, using Paul, from Scripture, from Romans 5, that the glory in our suffering that produces perseverance, that leads to character, that then leads to hope. What does that look like? How can we experience that in the various places of our suffering? What does God do? Can He be good when we are suffering? What's this whole project about? We get into some very deep places, and I would encourage you to just open your mind, open your soul. Let this speak to you. There's a couple moments early in our conversation where the internet connection broke for just a quick second, but it solidifies, so it's not going to be that way the whole time. Just stick with me here. And my conversation with Dr. Curt Thompson. Well, Dr. Curt Thompson, I am so honored and pleased. We've got some wonderful things to talk about. Just thank you for being here.
Well, Carol, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here, and as we were just saying a moment ago, I'm just really grateful for the work that you're doing, and it's really creating access for people to have the experience of knowing that somebody is coming to find them, and you're doing that in the work that you're doing. So thanks for doing this.
Thank you. That just blesses my soul just to hear that from you. I received that, and I thank you. We're going to talk about something hard today, suffering. Your book, The Deepest Place, Suffering and the Formation of Hope. It's rare that I say to people, everybody needs this book, but I say that about this because every one of us has experienced or is experiencing, and maybe the rare person who hasn't yet will experience suffering. So just maybe to begin, what is suffering? How you say to be human is to suffer? Just start there for a minute.
Well, I think people have asked, well, why did you write this? And I think I've come to a point where my response is, I think I've written it to honor, as an attempt to honor the suffering that my patients undergo, and that has led me to also become aware that the Christian story is the only kind of metaphysical story we have in the world that honors suffering. Eastern metaphysics would have us imagining that it doesn't really exist. We're just kind of doing what we can to just separate ourselves from it. Western metaphysics takes a different kind of approach where we name it and we see it as bad, only ever bad, and we're going to do everything we can. But we're also simultaneously kind of training ourselves to think that if we are suffering, then there must be something wrong with the world. There's something wrong with the world. And the Christian story tells us that our suffering is actually the world's and our expected response to the situation in which we find ourselves. And that this is the response of an intended beautiful world to our willingness to rebel. and our willingness as both humans and, as spiritual beings that, that we read about in the first chapter of Genesis, and as humans, we've got this, cosmic and earthbound willingness to decide that we want to live life on our terms, and we want to decide what's good and evil, and instead of letting God do that. And so we suffer in many respects. And simply from a medical, whether we're talking about, from a physical standpoint, whether we're talking about cancer or we're talking about disease processes or tragedies, things that happen to us, or if we're talking about emotional suffering,
Yes.
if we're talking about psychiatric suffering, what we're really talking about when it comes to suffering is we're talking about two phenomenon. One is we experience pain. We experience this noxious sensation to something emotionally, physically, whatever. But suffering is our response to that pain over time.
Mhm.
And it is the response over time that leads to this sense of my experience of pain being something that I then begin to tell a story about. And I begin to tell the story go away. And and included in that story is my sense of isolation with it. I'm having this experience by myself, and there's no way that this is ever going to end. And so, the biblical narrative really contends with this and addresses it from the standpoint of God saying quite simply and yet profoundly, Behold, I am with you.
Mm.
I am fully with you. And not with us like the chair is with us in the room, but with us and gazing upon us and inviting us to join him in his own willingness to suffer with us, so that we ultimately discover that we are not by ourselves with our pain.
Mm.
And this is one of the crucial elements. This notion that our attention is being drawn to the presence of others who are with us in our pain, and it is that process that lays the foundation for us to begin to tell a different story about our pain. And so even though our pain doesn't go away, Job's pain didn't go away. And his ultimate problem wasn't just, his pain. His ultimate problem was that he had friends who were with him and yet not really able to be with him. They wanted to fix his problem. They wanted to figure out what he'd done wrong that would cause all these ways in which simply willingness to be with him was kind of beyond their capacity. They couldn't tolerate his suffering, as it turns out. They couldn't tolerate it within themselves. And so I think in the book, what we're really trying to do is to allow ourselves to have a vision and then a practice of acknowledging that if you're going to be, if we're human, we might not be feeling it right now because we live in an environment, in a culture. Many of our listeners are folks. If we're living in the West, we have lots of ways, lots of accessories
Yeah.
that we can use to distract ourselves, to medicate ourselves from our suffering, and so we don't really sense it. But at some point in our life, those things are going to be peeled off, and we're going to be left with ourselves to deal with, and our suffering as a result. And so I think, the words of St. Paul have some things to say to us about that.
Yeah. Well, the medical part of what I have done, and certainly the medical part of what you have done, it's responding to people who are looking for a way to eliminate their suffering. And in
Hmm.
our culture of instant gratification, it's like whether your suffering is a little bit of boredom or whether it's excruciating physical or emotional pain, we still expect, okay, there's a pill for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the one of my seasons of suffering, when I lost my husband,
Mm,
7 going
mm,
on 8 years ago.
mm,
Um, as I reflect on that season, I experienced something that you unpack from Paul and his comments on suffering,
mm, mhm,
that knowing Jesus, we suffer, but we suffer differently.
mhm,
For
mm,
me, the grief in particular,
mm,
followers of we still grieve, but as Paul
mhm,
says in Thessalonians, we grieve differently. And
mhm,
I
mhm,
I experienced, I wouldn't have been able to say it at the time, but looking back, the hope that
mhm,
I had come to know in Jesus doesn't
mhm,
remove the pain. In
Hmm.
fact, there's
Hmm.
even some elements where the pain can feel more acute because her heart has been softened,
Hmm.
but the pain does not extinguish the hope.
Hmm.
And there are
Hmm.
moments when it's there at the same time. And your
Hmm.
your
Hmm.
your paradigm of what you talk about in the book is how suffering leads to hope, and that
Hmm.
is really the gospel story, and it can't happen any other way. Um,
Hmm.
it's just been a very personal thing where those pieces have come together for me. I don't know that somebody who has not gone through deep suffering can quite imagine those things being present together.
Right. Well, one of the things that I think that just culturally and even within bodies of believers, especially when we read this particular passage of Paul, and we're talking about the fifth chapter of Romans,
Yes.
the first few verses of this, and we hear this progression from suffering to perseverance to character to hope. We can read that and kind of think that this just happens rather magically.
Yeah.
Like if I just suffer, then somehow magically I'm going to persevere, and then I'm going to magically develop character. But we also have to be aware that before we ever get to that part, that there are some things that come before this in what he's writing, and this notion that really stands out to me, at least, when he says, "Therefore, since through faith we've been justified." We read those words, and those words pass by us pretty quickly, because if we have any familiarity with the church, they just become kind of like distant echoes of
Yeah.
things that we've heard before, and so they're pretty meaningless. But when we talk about faith, and when we talk about pardon me, justification, long before those are theological terms, those are terms that represent real embodied human interactions. And when it comes to faith, we're really talking about trust. And when it comes to trust, we're talking about trust between one person and another. And when we talk about that, we're talking about attachment.
Yes.
And that attachment is something that we experience not either as an abstraction, we experience it as an embodied encounter between child and parent, between husband and wife, between friends. This sense that it is not some abstract thing that we call faith. It's not just some cognitive assent to an abstract set of ideas. It is an embodied and felt sense of being seen, soothed, safe, secure, practicing this.
Yeah.
And Paul moves from this to this notion that therefore we have peace with God. And the more work we do with attachment, we come to discover, oh, there are actually parts of me, not all of me, but there are parts of me that are still at war with God. We think about the woman in Mark 5, and this is not the only gospel story that we hear it, but the woman in Mark 5 who had the bleeding dyscrasia, and she comes with a plan. She has a plan for healing, kind of commando healing. We're going to get in, get the job done, get out. Nobody's going to see me.
Yep.
And there's a sense in which she's willing to come to Jesus with a certain part of her story. And that part of her story has to do with the embodied part, because it's the part that is obviously the most acutely messy, literally in all respects.
Yeah.
And she figures that once we get this done, and the text reads, in Mark's text, it reads, and she felt in her body that she had been healed. Now, interesting, like the text is telling us her sense of things, of course, after the fact. But the text is not telling us what she didn't know that was coming.
Wow.
And what was coming was that Jesus stops the crowd.
Wow.
And you can imagine when he asks, who touched me? She's like, wow, this plan is now way off the rails.
Yep.
I thought we were just going to like take care of this quietly, and that was my issue. But as it turns out, the bleeding was just the tip of the iceberg for her,
Mhm.
because this is a woman who, because of her medical condition, has not been called daughter, has not been called my wife, is not a mother, socially scorned, all the things that are much bigger for her implication wise. And so this is what we mean when we say, I can have a part of me that I'm willing to bring to God and make peace over, my bleeding. But I got other parts that, whether I know it or not, like I might not even know this, other parts of me that are still at war with God. Believe that, like, how, okay, you can heal my bleeding, but how are you going to heal the rest of my life that has become so devastated because of my bleeding? And yet there Jesus is, making it plain, not just to her, but publicly, that you are someone I'm going to receive in front of everybody. We're going to receive all of you. We're not just going to have this private physical healing event, because I want to heal all of you.
Yeah.
And so we discover that there are parts of me that still believe that I'm at war with God, and it is his intention to make peace with all of them. And it's then that I get to this part of the text where he talks about glory, this glory that when we read about in John's gospel, this glory of the only Son of the Father, this relational glory, this sense that we are the object of God's pleasure.
Wow.
The glory that we're being asked to share, that Paul talks about, we live with the hope of sharing in the glory of God. It's not just some fantastic, brilliant, powerful awareness of a being. It's as much about God saying to us, oh my gosh, I can't believe I get to be your dad. And how are we responding to that sense of being welcomed into the life of God? And if this is what I'm paying attention to, if I am living in a community in which, as the body of believers, we are living with secure attachment, we are living with this embodied sense of standing in grace, not as just a theology, but as a felt sense of being loved. If this glory is something that I'm living in an embodied way on a moment to moment, day to day basis, that is the posture that I take into my suffering.
Mm. I'm so glad you went to attachment, and how it must be secure that we
Mm,
need to go through our suffering with. One of the most frequent things I hear from the people who write to me or who I talk with has to do with that perception that I'm at war with God, that
mm,
God is disappointed in me. Disappointed is one of the most frequent. When I ask somebody, in the right part of your brain, the emotional part of your heart, how do you feel that God feels about you?
mm,
Disappointed is almost always at the top
mm,
of the list.
mm, mm,
That,
mm,
I'm doing all the things and God's not
mm,
coming through for me, so he must be disappointed in me.
mm, mm,
And
mm,
in coming to process that so that I truly am at peace with God, then the glory
mhm,
can come and the secure attachment. I'm not
mhm.
sure anybody can get from suffering to hope without doing that. If I still feel at war with God, I'm not going to get there. So, can you speak to a minute about what that process is like in getting from feeling like God is disappointed at me to, oh, I'm so pleased to be your father, to be here with you that you just described?
Well, you can imagine. Let's just for a moment. That's a great question, Carol, because I think if you can imagine, just for a moment, our same woman from Mark 5. Let's just imagine for a moment, someone had said to her, "Hey, you should go meet Jesus because he can heal you, but I think he will probably have other things for you too. He'll probably want you to be welcomed into the community and so on." And so you could tell her this. And at the same time, there will be enough memory within her
Mhm.
about what it has been like to have been shunned,
Yes.
that the risk of imagining that Jesus might welcome her hospitably beyond just curing her illness would be too great.
Yeah.
And yet, this is often what happens. We preach from pulpits. We are no longer at war with God. But like, how am I going to know? Like, it's hard for me to imagine that, because I'll hear that on a Sunday morning and I'll go home and I will still believe that I'm at war. There will be parts of me that will be at war. Not until I come to your office and I have a conversation with you, Carol, in which you start to ask me questions about hard things, things that I'm not talking to anybody else about. And when I name these hard things, I meet an embodied, I meet a facial expression of loving kindness. I hear a tone of voice that is gentle and soft. I see a gaze that is um, hospitable. And that very act, those very moments of being in the room with someone who is creating and making peace with me, with the parts of me that I'm actually at war with, you become the hands and feet and voice of a Jesus who is persuading me in my very chest that God is not at war with me around these things. And for me to believe that I have peace with God in all these different parts, I'm actually going to have an experience with someone who is God's representative, who gives me an embodied experience of what peacemaking looks like and feels like. And when I have enough of that kind of practice, then what I read in Paul eventually begins to make embodied sense.
Thank you for expressing how that needs our human presence, the ministry of presence, what God designed the body of Christ to be about, and what you have been doing now for years in confessional communities, and I've been privileged to experience that. Because of what I have been doing, a reasonable amount of my work has been online. And so I hear people write to me online who say things like, that sounds great, but I have nobody. My
Mhm.
family's pushed me away. I don't have any friends. The church says I'm a hypocrite, and I'm just here by myself. So I really can't. I can't get there. I can't experience that. And there's back and forth, and I try and work with them about that. But just talk a bit about how critical that human to human connection is, and what you might say to somebody who feels that way.
Right. Well, one thing I would say, the first thing I would say, Carol, is this whole notion of longing to be connected
Mhm.
and looking around and seeing all kinds of evidence of being pushed away,
Yeah.
of being stiff armed, of being scapegoated, of being exiled, all the things. Pardon me. I would want to say to our listeners who feel that if we were together with Jesus in the room, I think he would say to you, the first thing he would say to you would be, "Oh my gosh, you know exactly what it's like for me to be me.
Wow.
I'm so glad you're talking about this because now I have yet one more experience of what it's like to know that a human knows exactly what it's like for me. Because you know what? I must have asked 70 or 80 people to go with me to the promised land before Abraham, I finally found somebody who would say yes. And then, when I actually got to Bethlehem, we got chased to Egypt. And then I'm asking people who are saying they don't want to follow because they got to go like check out a piece of land that they just bought. I'm like, that's weird. Or they've got to go bury their dad. And I'm like, okay, but here's the thing. God knows exactly what this is like
Wow.
to want to be received, and we stiff arm him. In fact, we do more than this. We'll kill him. And we did.
Yes.
And so this is a Jesus who knows exactly what it's like. And at the same time, uh, Jesus makes no apology in his insistence that this is the way it is done. And so we would say, when we say things like, I don't have a confessional community, I don't know where am I going to go find one? To which we say, yeah, this is really hard. And I think the answer is we're going to make one.
Yes.
you're going to form one.
Yes.
You, just like God, are going to find that this is hard work, because people, if people are serious about the work, you're going to find them eventually. And it may mean you're going to ask, I would think like, oh, there's one, think of one, well, I don't have any friends. No friends. Really, no, you know nobody at all. Well, there may be people that you wish, is there anybody that you wish could be your friend?
Mm-hmm.
I say, well, you're going to have to take the risk and ask them, would you be willing to meet with me and start for us to talk about our stories with each other? And our listeners are going to think like, Curt, that's nuts. That's all, you're a whack job. I think like, well, okay, maybe, but that's why maybe, psychiatry, you got to live on the edge a little bit if you're going to be a psychiatrist. This sense that it is risky to do, and there is no greater payoff when you eventually find the one or two or three people who are going to do this with you. And our listeners might think like, oh, well, gosh, that's just not helpful. To which I would say, this is hard,
Mm-hmm.
and there is no other way.
Yep.
And so you can decide you're not going to put in the effort of taking the risk. You can do that and remain where you are and remain in your suffering in the way that you are. Or we can start to take the risk of doing the very things that will make us more aware than ever of what it was actually like to be Jesus while he was here.
Wow. Wow. You are talking about what I might say is the third source of suffering that you describe. And I know many of our listeners will be very well aware that things have happened to us and
Mhm.
we've done stuff. Stuff has
Mm.
happened to me. And then there's ways in which I've been my own worst enemy and done stuff back to me and to others. And those are certainly two very appropriate sources of suffering that need to be contended with and healed. But you also talk about a third source of suffering, the suffering in transformation. And
Mhm.
you're kind of talking a bit about that in doing this hard work. I
Mhm.
think of the scripture in Hebrews, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. In the process of becoming like Jesus, we may shed some blood. Can you talk a
Mhm.
bit more about that?
Yeah, well, let me just first say to our listeners, like the whole idea, I mean, thanks a lot, Carol, for bringing up that scripture, because because like the whole idea of shedding blood as a way to suffer on the way to God, like, is not my idea of a good time.
Right.
Right. As I said at the beginning of the book, if I were going to pick up a book to read about suffering, I would want to read that. I would hope that that book would show me how I would like get to suffer like less and less. But
Right.
I wouldn't resolve my problem. Um, I mean, what you're saying right here, in many respects, like that verse, in many respects, could be I mean, it could be a poster child verse for what we're getting at.
Mm.
Like it could be the verse that would say, look, as we said earlier, um, we live in a world in which our suffering is a result of the intended beauty of the world and its intended goodness that has gone awry because of what we've done and because of what we do. And so we can and because we are also working against unseen world forces. We're working against the prince of the air. We're working against the ruler of this world, so to speak, as Jesus calls him. We are pushing against the earth in that regard. And in that sense, you can guarantee that if you're going to do this work of suffering in order to join Jesus in his sufferings, you can be guaranteed that evil is not about to go quietly into the night.
Yes.
And that means that we are eventually going to face things that will feel like it is bleeding us dry in order for us to continue to follow the King. And this is where Christian community makes a difference. This is where our connection with Jesus, this is where I tell people it is imperative. Uh, it is imperative that we be immersed in the texts, that we be immersed in prayer, that we be immersed in community. And for many of us, those aren't things that we actually do. And in that regard, we aren't that much of a bother for evil.
Wow.
And for many of us, our suffering is something that we easily avoid because of all of our, accessories that I can use in my addictions and so forth that I can, distract myself. And because of what I'm doing to keep myself disconnected from my suffering, evil doesn't really have to spend much time paying attention to me.
Wow.
It is only when we become committed to living in the real world, the world in which the kingdom of God is breaking in, and therefore the kingdom of darkness is going to throw everything it has at it. If we are willing to live in that world, it's going to require things of us, this immersion in text and prayer and community, that if that's where we go, our suffering will be revealed. Instead of what we're usually doing, which is doing everything we can to avoid it.
Yep. Yep. Wow. Can you talk a bit about what the hope really is? Paul is clear. This is going somewhere.
Mm,
There is hope. In one sense, a destination, in another sense, part of the journey. What is that? What can
mhm,
we reasonably put there? I talk with some people who say, "Well, God's not working for me because I pray and He doesn't fix anything."
mm,
Um,
mm,
it's more than
mm,
that. That this isn't
mm,
a heavenly vending
mm.
machine. But what is that hope? What are we after?
That's pretty good. I've not heard that, a heavenly vending machine. That's a great phrase. Well, I would say I have become I have become shaped by what for me has been really a helpful fiction as much as I have been by theology. And one of the pieces that many of us know and that we return to is the fiction of Tolkien and Lewis and so forth.
Yeah.
And the whole notion of uh, the new heaven and earth is coming, and the real question is not, oh, what do I need to do to get there? The real question is, will I be able to tolerate it when it arrives?
Yes.
And so that leads to the question of like, how is this life enabling me to practice for the heaven that's coming?
Wow.
And what is God doing to form me into the person who would be able to tolerate his heaven? This Dallas Willard was famous for, I heard him in a talk once said, in his Missouri drawl, God will let anyone into his heaven who can take it. And so we would say that one of the things that suffering is doing is it is, I mean, when I say suffering, it's not like, oh, God makes the world and then he thinks to himself, gosh, how can I really help people become more like us? Oh, I'll toss suffering in. No, he's not cavalier. He's not capricious in this way. But God is a God that is redeeming everything and using everything, even evil, to redeem everything.
Yes.
And so the suffering is going to be used to transfer me into a particular kind of person, not just get me into a certain place. So the question is, to what degree am I becoming in the course of my life a person of greater love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control? To what degree am I becoming a person of greater wisdom, a person of greater, like, am I becoming living, breathing, embodied forgiveness? Am I becoming these things? It's not just have I acquired a benchmark or do I like check all the boxes so that I get in someplace? But the question is, who am I becoming? I'm not a problem to be fixed. I talk about this in The Soul of Desire. I'm not a problem to be fixed. I'm not a pathology to be diagnosed and treated. I am an artistic work that God is bringing to completion. That's who we are, these objects of beauty and goodness. And so this then becomes the question that I'm putting to people is like, who are we becoming? Not what am I acquiring for my life?
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Um, one last question. I feel like we could probably talk for 3 hours here, but one last question. Not everybody experiences suffering, perseverance, character, hope. Suffering takes some people down. What makes the difference? We have to say God makes character and hope available to all, but where is our agency then? What makes the difference between those who get taken out and those who grow into hope?
Well, I don't know. This isn't. I think this is not, Carol, prescriptive. This
Right.
reflection I'm going to offer. Um, it's more an observation of what I see, and that is, you see this when we do marriage therapy. Um, you come to find that when a couple comes in and they're in conflict, so much of what's bound up in that conflict at first glance, you think, oh, is because each party has a complaint about the nature or character of the other person, that they are a certain way, that they wish them to be different, and so forth and so on. But pretty quickly, one of the things that you discover is that both parties, as it turns out, are less interested in the other party being perfectly what they need and want them to be. And they're actually more interested in knowing that the other party is in the game of working at change,
Mhm, mhm.
that they're really serious about it. They're not just talking about it, they're actually working toward loving the other, no matter how imperfectly they're doing this. When they start to see that their spouse is really turning the corner of intention and movement, even if we do that movement imperfectly, that's what makes the difference. And so this gets right to the heart of the question of perseverance.
Yes.
This question of, when I'm suffering, how am I going to practice responding to it in the context of community? And that's where community is a big deal. If you're going to ask me personally to respond in isolation to my suffering all by myself, that's going to be a very different response
Yep.
than if I am going to be sure that I'm in the context of community and we're going to do this together, so that I am not forming hope for me, but we together are forming hope for me. We are forming hope for you. We do this together. And another thing that we come to find out about character is the following. I mean, you know this to be true. The people that you know who you find to be people of deep character, people of integrity, people of humility, people of, like, all these. If you were to say to him, John, or to her, Sarah, I'm just so touched by your humility, by your da, 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 you know that if it's true, John and Sarah are both going to say to you, I don't know what you're talking about, because, like, all I'm paying attention to, all I can see is, like, all the ways in which I'm still, like, not loving Jesus very much, not loving my neighbor well enough, and you're like, uh, I don't know what you're talking about, because the person character is often not a thing that I'm actually always very aware of.
That's good.
It's what other people see because of the perseverance. And this is what the Gospels tell, right? Jesus would say, you love one another. And when you love one another, people will look at you and know that you're my disciples. And you might look at each other and be like, I'm not loving you very well at all. I'm not very, and, we see the light that is reflected while we continue to sense our longing to be transformed, which is what humility is really about. And so this character that we form is often not something that we necessarily are aware of, but that other people would point to and say, I see this, and I see this, and I see this. And we're left saying, thanks be to God. But it is something that we then, in so practicing this perseverance, we are forming an anticipated future in which, even if life does not give me what I want, I can be comfortable and confident in the future, because I know that I'm not going to be left alone in the room, because of the people of God who represent the presence of Jesus and the presence of the Holy Spirit. And that's what durable hope comes to amount to. It comes to amount to an anticipated future in which I sense that I will be loved, I will be seen, soothed, safe, secure, even in the middle of my pain. I can have all kinds of hope for things that doesn't really cost me anything.
Mhm.
That hope might not be that durable, but the most durable hope we form, we do so in the context of suffering, in the context of a loving, vulnerable community.
Wow. That's hope. I feel it, you know,
Mm, mm,
um, and not that it eliminates the suffering. That's not the point. It's what can be formed. And
mm,
you have
mm,
said so often, Curt, the thing of goodness and beauty that we are becoming and that God has given us to create in the world, we become those artifacts as
mhm,
we do
mhm,
this, as we keep
mhm,
showing up.
mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think this notion we get to the very end of this section of Paul's this opening section of Paul's fifth chapter to the church at Rome, and we get this notion that hope does not put us to shame, for the love of God has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. And it brings us full circle back around to this. Hope doesn't disappoint because it reminds us of how deeply loved we are. It reminds us of our attachment. It reminds us of glory. It is re-strengthening that whole cycle and circle that brings us from secure attachment and glory into spaces of suffering, perseverance, hope, perseverance, character, hope, and back to attachment and glory once again because of the love that has been given to us. We haven't had to work to earn it. We haven't had to prove ourselves, even though there are parts of us that still worry that I'm going to have to. And with each round, Jesus comes into yet one more room of my house where there are parts of me that are still holding out, believing that I'm at war with God. And the next round, he'll come for another room. And then he'll come for another room. Because this is kind of how we do it, just like the woman in Mark 5. She brought one room. Yeah, you can come into the foyer of my house where everything's most obvious. And Jesus is like, oh, that's great. Let's go look in your kitchen. Let's go look in your pantry. Let's go look in the bedroom. Let's go look in the basement. Because he is unwilling to let anything go without being given the opportunity to be welcomed into his heaven.
Wow. Full circle. I feel like there are really no more words I want to offer
Mm,
except
mm,
thank you. Uh,
mm,
and we will make sure, Curt, that all the links are
mm,
available to people here.
mm,
The deepest place, suffering in the
mm.
formation of hope. You have helped us form hope. Blessings to you.
Oh, thanks be to God. Thank you so much. Great to be with you, Carol.
Oh, friends, the deepest place, suffering in the formation of hope. Unless you're one of those rare people, and I don't think you are, who doesn't experience suffering, you will want to explore this. So check the links under this video. We've got it to the book, to Dr. Thompson's websites and other social media and YouTube and his Being Known podcast, powerful podcast. So check those things out. We also have links to a couple articles from our website about experiencing God in your past trauma and what is it like to find your people. We talked about those things in this episode, and those couple articles are there also. I would love to hear from you. Feel free to leave a comment under this video, or if you want to leave a confidential comment, come over to my website, drcarolministries.com. You can comment there, and that's confidential, and I read every one and respond whenever I can be helpful. Thank you for subscribing, and we put material up here essentially every week. I would love you to subscribe and share. Share this with your friends. And until next time, may God bless you.